Almost 4 years after her resignation, when she gets an unmarked package in the mail, she gingerly carries it outside her Montana home and hurls it as far as she can. If it doesn't explode, she might open it. It's a puzzling state of affairs for a woman who is one of the rising stars of public service on behalf of public lands. But then again not, given the hijacking of government agencies by timber, mining, and energy industries. In fact, immediately following 9/11, when right-wing politicians in the western states seized the moment to equate environmentalists with terrorists, Gloria testified before Congress to the House Resources Subcommittee on Forests and Forest Health, which was looking into eco-terrorism and lawlessness on national forests. She reported how she and her Forest Service colleagues had themselves been the target of state-condoned anti-federal actions. Gloria had arrived at the Forest Service in 1977 at a historic moment when a potent set of national environmental laws were finally seeing the forest for the trees. Part of the mandate was to support multiple use that also protected water, air, and endangered species. But the other intent was to give the public a real say in how public lands are managed. It was as much about democracy as about conservation. Gloria spent over 2 decades in the Intermountain West at national forests in 6 states. She witnessed commercial logging that, if you blinked your eyes, looked like the aftermath of a world war. She was deeply influenced by Paul Hawken's book, The Ecology of Commerce, and began to put forth a far broader perspective on the value of forests as providers of ecosystem services, irreducible and irreplaceable services such as oxygen and water and habitat for wild creatures and wild-loving people. But when Gloria put the kibosh on the oil and gas industry's proposed drilling of the Rocky Mountain Front in Montana's Bob Marshall Wilderness, known as the American Serengeti, she did so based not solely on ecological good sense, but on the wishes of the 80% of people from 49 of 50 states across the country who participated in the 2-year review process. She also made some very powerful enemies. Her leadership landed her the job of supervisor of the Humboldt-Toyabe National Forest in Nevada, the largest in the lower 48. But it was also the infamous stronghold of the Sagebrush Rebellion, of anti-government extremists, who had already bombed the office and car of another Forest Service employee. That's when the battle flared that brought intensified threats against Gloria and her employees. Ultimately, she chose to resign rather than be assigned to a gulag, in outraged protest over flagrant government complicity in undermining its own official policies and endangering its own employees. The current White House is now engineering a healthy forests policy that will leave little on our public lands and national forests except scarred landscapes and a proliferation of bushes. Because 9 out of 10 Americans Because 9 out of 10 Americans favor wilderness protection, this scornful policy seems to echo the comments made by Fortune magazine shortly after the Seattle uprising against the WTO, when Fortune said, "Democracy used to be a good thing, but now it has gotten into the hands of the wrong people." Indeed, it has. This year brought out a record number of whistleblowers against the government's lawless conduct and ready, fire, aim policies. And in the first year of the terror-slaying Bush administration, acts of violence against natural resource employees spiked dramatically, including bombings, beatings, and arson. After leaving the Forest Service, Gloria went on to found SOS, Sustainable Obtainable Solutions, a nonprofit organization to ensure the sustainability of public lands and the plant, animal, and human communities that depend on them. She speaks widely and has received numerous awards, including the Giraffe Award for sticking her neck out. Gloria Flora is a real shiro, an unreasonable woman of the highest order, a brave guardian of the public trust, and a true patriot. Please join me in giving a rousing Bioneers welcome to the irrepressible Gloria Flora.
Thank you. Thank you very much. What a joy it is to be here. In the last century, forest management was demarcated by a precarious blend of consumption, regulation, preservation, none being quite comfortable with each other. I suggest that in this century, forests should be demarcated by restoration and democracy. And I mean restoration and democracy in their broadest senses. Democracy in the sense that every alive person who is engaged and interested should have a voice. But not only should those people have a voice, but all of us need to speak for those who are yet unborn, because they too have a voice in how public lands are managed. In restoration, restoration means to renew, revive, to make whole. I think that we definitely need to restore our forest landscapes, but we also need to restore the landscape of society, and we need to restore the landscape of hope. In the context of public lands, I don't believe that restoration or that democracy can occur without a fundamental recognition of the importance of the human connection to landscapes and of the importance of sustainability. To sustain landscapes, we need to sustain ourselves, and to sustain ourselves, we need to sustain landscapes. So, once upon a time, I joined a tribe. I joined the tribe of the United States Forest Service. This was in 1977. What did that tribe look like? Well, from my eyes, my young, female, idealistic, landscape architecture eyes, with my love for the wild and my love for the beauty, meaning, and solitude that one finds in nature, and my distinct dislike for clear-cuts, I had an interesting perspective. The same time period, the 1970s, was also a period of time when timber management ruled in the Forest Service. The Forest Service actually increased production of timber in terms of board feet from 4 billion board feet per year to 12 billion board feet per year. So if you think something odd was going on in the 70s, you were right. I saw that the deck of power, of money, of authority was definitely stacked towards commodity and tradition and business as usual. In the ensuing years, I was really struck by a couple of other things. One was the power of politics. That meant that knowledge and fairness really weren't nearly as important as being politically correct. I also learned that science was actually playing a very weak role in decision-making, that science focused on a single resource, not on the complex interrelationships of those resources. There was also selective use of science, and indeed, you could dismiss information if you thought it was contradictory to what you wanted to do. This engendered many unsustainable practices, and this was really getting irritating because our national forests are our national treasure chests. You can't keep taking things out of the treasure chest without replenishing it. Also in the Forest Service, very unfortunately at this time, even though NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, had been in effect for almost a decade, and NEPA required that the Forest Service listen to public opinion, the disdain for public involvement in the early 80s was palpable. No one in the Forest Service, well, few people in the Forest Service truly believed that the public had anything intelligent to say about public land management. And what was even more painful for me to witness was that there was a complete dismissal of opinions if they were non-scientific or they smacked of emotion. So let's fast forward 15 years about. There was a smattering of difference in line officers by that point. About 14% were women. The great fear of the white rulers had been realized. We were taking over. 15% they considered a majority. There was a greater effort to pay attention to public involvement, and the reason that I believe there was not some altruistic shining light that entered people's souls, but the fact that after 15 years of lawsuits, which the Forest Service continually lost, they started to realize that, hey, maybe the public is right or has a better idea. But also during this time, I came to what I call the big truth. All natural resource decisions are social decisions. Science informs and helps us make those decisions, but it is not the reason why certain decisions are made. There was also something huge that happened in the Forest Service, and that is an evolution to ecosystem management. In 1992, the Forest Service announced that we were changing. We were going to now manage the land in terms of ecosystems instead of in terms of single resources. Now, this is exciting, but consider the fact that this was just 11 years ago. We talked about the interrelationships of the biological and the physical components of ecosystems. We talked about managing in a broader spatial and temporal context. We devised committees, a whole hierarchy of committees that were going to help the Forest Service transition from traditional ways of doing business to this broader and new way of thinking. This was greeted with much excitement and much distrust. And for 12 of us, of the 32,000 employees, great fear. Why great fear? Because 12 of us in the Forest Service said, oh my God. Of those 6 principles articulated about ecosystem management, not one of them mentioned humans. We were on a crash course. So, knowing how to work within a bureaucracy, the 12 of us had ourselves chartered as one of the committees. We were actually a subcommittee of the mapping committee of the GIS committee. Tucked away in our little skunk works, we came up with what is now called the 7th principle, that humans are an integral part of ecosystems. Wise decisions cannot be made without including the human wants and needs as part of a decision about ecosystem management. Indeed, the symbol for ecosystem management in the Forest Service is now 3 interlocking circles: physical, biological, human, equally as important. What do I mean by human dimensions of ecosystems? What people want out of landscapes? Well, of course, people want goods and services out of landscape. We've known that for a long time. However, we contend that people want experiences from landscapes, that landscapes have meaning in terms of heritage, in terms of culture, in terms of their legacy value, what we are leaving to our grandchildren. And as importantly, people have a spiritual relationship with landscapes. Now, when we put our little list together in our research papers, we called it the metaphysical relationship because we didn't want to scare anybody off, and we figured it would take them a while to figure out what we really meant by metaphysical. What we meant by metaphysical was really an ecology of the heart, honoring humans' relationship with the natural world and honoring people's sense of place, people's identity with landscapes. So, wonderful principle, wonderful idea, but could it be put into practice? Well, in 1997, I had that opportunity. At that time, I was the forest supervisor of the Lewis and Clark National Forest in north central Montana. We were doing an analysis and had been spending several years on that analysis, looking at the potential for oil and gas leasing on the forest, and if we were to lease, under what stipulations would this land be leased? Well, part of the forest is the incredible Rocky Mountain front. This is a stretch of 100 miles of landscape that is largely undeveloped. It is where the Great Plains slam into the limestone ramparts of the overthrust belt of the Rocky Mountains. You have cliffs soaring thousands of feet. You have the most incredibly rich ecotone. You have the largest herd of elk in the United States, the second largest herd of bighorn sheep. You have the largest winter gathering of mule deer. You have every large charismatic carnivore you could want. Grizzly bear, wolves, lynx, wolverines, you name it, they're there. And they're not just there, they're thriving. Indeed, every plant and animal species, with the exception of free-roaming bison, that were present at the time of Lewis and Clark are present and thriving on the Rocky Mountain front today. So, after years of studying the ecology and the physical aspects of this beautiful landscape, we also looked at the human dimension. We met endlessly in private and public meetings with citizens, organizations, politicians, industry, trying to understand what people wanted and thought about this landscape. So, I had the opportunity, coincidentally, as if there are coincidences in the universe, on the 20th anniversary of my joining the tribe, I signed a decision that did not allow leasing on the Rocky Mountain front. Thank you. And the really exciting thing is that I was able to admit exactly why I made that decision. I made it for two reasons. One was the profound ecological and cultural significance of that landscape, and secondly was people's extreme attachment, people's sense of place. Now, to my knowledge, that was the first time and the only time that people's sense of place figured prominently in a significant decision in the Forest Service. And I say that not as a brag, I say that as a lament. Why are we not using that as an important criteria in making decisions about these lands that belong to all of us? So, what was really exciting was after I made the decision. The response was dramatic, and it was very uplifting. Industry accused me. The worst thing they could think of to say was that I listened too much to the public. What a hoot. People sent me flowers. I had over 400 letters and phone calls of thanks from the American public. People sent me photographs of their grandchildren and said, I want you to see who you made this decision for. I had notes from Forest Service employees, people I had never met, that said, thank you. Today I was proud to put on my uniform. I wish every decision maker in the Forest Service had that experience at least once, because they would make very different decisions if they understood that. And 2 years later, I left the Forest Service. What happened? Oh, I went to a new setting, a new ecosystem. But that wasn't the reason. I engaged face-to-face in a very personal way with the antis. The anti-federal, the anti-democracy, the anti-restoration, the anti-environment factions. They were headed by a small group of county commissioners who were ideologues who really had no tolerance for divergence of opinion. They indeed believed that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo assured them that they were not responsive or responsible to the United States justice system, nor were they required to follow the regulations that had been promulgated since the inception of the United States Forest Service. As Kenny told you, there had been years of threat prior to my arrival, which continued and intensified after I got there. And it wasn't just, spit in your eye, your mother wears army boots kind of threats and intimidation of Forest Service employees and their families, but it was threats to burn your house down if you make the wrong decision. It was threats, I'm going to rape you if I find you in the field again alone. Indeed, we didn't allow our employees to go in the field alone. We told our employees, do not wear uniforms, do not drive green vehicles, do not identify yourself as a Forest Service employee, and it's probably a good idea to warn your children and your spouses not to mention the fact that you work for the Forest Service. What is that? These people tore up and abused humans, and they abused landscapes with impunity. They were supported by a reactionary sole-source newspaper in town, the likes of which boldly printed an editorial that congratulated Slobodan Milosevic for showing the world how to deal with the UN. This dangerous cowardice that we saw, this mob mentality, hiding and being fearful of stepping forward and saying anything different, really shut down democracy completely. People who supported the Forest Service or what we were doing would come to us in private or call us in private and say, don't tell anybody, but I actually support what you're doing, but I don't want the public to know because they might boycott my business or start treating me like they treat you guys. Unfortunately, these activities were applauded, aided, and abetted by other elected officials at all levels. Fed bashing was really a spectator sport in Nevada, and people thought it was a real hoot that these little guys up in this county were giving the Forest Service their comeuppance. Indeed, the Forest Service, whom I turned to for support, my tribe, I was advised to use placation. Don't rock the boat. Well, clearly, if I couldn't protect my employees and their families from this level of harassment and intimidation, and if I couldn't effectively protect the lands that I was supposed to be the steward of, then I only had one choice, and that was to resign, which I did in a very loud and public way to call attention to the situation. So, what's all that have to do with restoration and democracy? Well, what I witnessed during my career in the Forest Service, unfortunately, I see happening in spades again in this administration. We're subsidizing many activities that are unsustainable. We are very busy creating more landscapes in need of restoration. And when I say we're subsidizing these activities that are unsustainable, I'm saying we're using your money to destroy your forests. Thank you. We still find that many people ignore both the human connection and natural capital if there's no dollar sign that they can attach to it. We find people rewriting or cherry-picking science to suit their foregone conclusions about how land should be managed. And we find that, particularly in this administration, they are ignoring and indeed undermining the democratic process, the tools that we use as citizens to participate in helping to manage our public lands. Why is this happening? Number one, the profit motive. If we change business as usual, somebody's going to make less money. I believe this is happening also because it's very difficult for people to intervene, because I find, particularly in the rural West, individuals and communities are in future shock. Alvin Toffler defined future shock as the extreme stress and shattering disorientation that we feel when change happens more quickly than we can adapt. But I think what's really underneath it is a fear of unquantifiable values and a fear of the voice of our own hearts. And this is a fear because these values are so big. They are so important. They would overshadow all the quantifiable values. Indeed, the most important things in our life are not quantifiable. So why should we make our opinions about public lands quantifiable? Thank you. So, what to do? Well, when I left the Forest Service, I decided to start a nonprofit organization with the mission of doing what I thought the Forest Service really ought to be doing, and that is ensuring the sustainability of public lands and ensuring the sustainability of the plant, animal, and human communities that depend on them. And how do we do this? Well, we try to help communities, businesses, organizations, collaborative groups, agencies, try to help them learn about systems thinking, that everything is connected and related. We try to help them develop criteria to assess the sustainability of their own proposals. SOS also partners with others because we know that there's strength in unity. SOS is a leader in the coalition to protect the Rocky Mountain front, because although there's no new leasing, there were some existing leases on Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management properties. And in this permissive administration, the leaseholders are working at breakneck speed to try to get in this window. I'm also working with a group called Champion Tree Project International, doing a wonderful job of preserving the genetics of the largest and oldest trees of every species in the United States and beyond. And we're doing this not just to create archival living libraries of these wonderful specimens that have survived so much and are so exemplify their habitats, but because we want people to see these trees and then start thinking about sustainability. Sustainability not only in national forests, but in their own backyards, in their national parks. Indeed, we want to see sustainable urban forestry, also a hallmark of this century. And thank you. And so what can you do? I say get informed about the places that are important to you. Status quo of those places is not guaranteed. And if you can't do that, you can't get informed or involved, then support others who are with either your time, your moral support, or your dollars. Make your voice heard. I can't tell you. I know people think that it's trite and useless to write to decision makers, but it is not. Even if they don't agree with you, when people get a letter that someone has taken the time to write to express an opinion about landscape management, they know that that person overcame procrastination and certain fears to do that. And there are probably hundreds of others of their constituency who feel the same way but haven't yet overcome that procrastination. So you are speaking for many, not just the unborn, when you take the time to write a letter or make a phone call or a fax to your representatives. And I want you to vote. I want you to vote twice. Vote in the voting booth, but also vote every time you lay dollars down on the checkout counter line. You are voting that you approve of the way this product was produced, of the natural resources that it used, and the energy that it took to get to you. Be careful what you vote for. And I want you to practice restoration. Practice restoration in your own backyard, in your neighborhood. Practice restoration of your commitment to living more sustainably. And most importantly, restore your heart connection to the rest of the universe through the landscapes that you love, because it's all connected. Thank you.
Go ahead and stay here.